The Great Gain of Godliness, Chapter 10. God records the piety of His people. The second good effect of the saints' piety was that God recorded it. A book of remembrance was written before Him. The word in the original for book of remembrance signifies a book of memorials or monuments. The words immediately foregoing recite God's hearkening and hearing, but lest any should say, though God does at the present hear the holy speeches and thoughts of His children, yet may not in time slip out of His mind, therefore these words are added. A book of remembrance was written before Him. The Lord did not only hear the good speeches of the saints, but recorded them and wrote them down. A book of remembrance was written. This is spoken after the manner of man, that not God has any book of records by Him. He does not need to write down anything for the help of His memory. He is not subject to forgetfulness. Things done 1,000 years ago are as fresh to Him as if they were done but yesterday. 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past. Psalm 90, verse 4. In this book of remembrance, therefore, is a borrowed form of speech taken from kings who have their chronicles, wherein they note memorable things. King Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus had his book of records, wherein were written the worthy deeds of Mordecai. Esther 6, verse 1 and 2. So God bears in mind all the good speeches and pious actions of His children. God's particular and critical assessment is a book of records where nothing can be lost or torn out. Doctrine: God eternally remembers all the good designs and pious endeavors of His people. God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which ye have showed towards His name. Hebrews 6, verse 10. There are 8 things which God writes down in His book of remembrance. The first is, the Lord writes down the names of His saints, whose names are in the book of life. Philippians 4, verse 3. This book has no errata. Revelation 3, verse 5. The second is, the Lord writes down the good speeches of His people. When Christians speak together of the mysteries of heaven, which is like music in concert, God is much taken with it when their tongues are going. God's pen is going in heaven. They that feared the Lord spake often one to another, and a book of remembrance was written. 3. The Lord writes down the tears of His people. Tears drop down to the earth, but they reach heaven too. God has His bottle and His book. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? Psalm 56, verse 8. Tears drop from the saints as water from the roses. They are fragrant to God, and He puts them in His bottle. And besides this, He has His book of remembrance, where He sets them down. Are they not in thy book? Especially God writes down such tears as are shed for the sins of the times. One was clothed with linen, with a writer's inkhorn by his side. Ezekiel 9, verse 2. This was to write down the tears of the mourners and to set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst of the city. Verse 4. Point 4. God writes down the thoughts of his people. We can write down men's words, but we cannot write down their thoughts. It would perplex the angels to write men's thoughts, but be assured, never a holy thought comes into our mind, but God writes it down. So, in the text, a book of remembrance was written for them that thought upon his name. Two things are silent, yet have a voice: tears. Psalm 6 verse 8, and thoughts. Isaiah 66:18. Point 5. God writes down the desires of his people. All my desires is before thee. Psalm 38:9. That is, it is set down in thy book. Desire is the spiritual appetite or the soul's panting and breathing after God. Psalm 84 verse 2. In this life we do rather desire God than enjoy him. Can we say that we take our souls out of the quiver of our bodies and shoot them into heaven? Do our affections sally forth towards Christ? Do we desire him superlatively and incessantly? Every such desire is put down in God's register book. All my desires is before thee. Point 6. The Lord writes down the prayers of his people. John 2 verse 7. Prayer, though it be not vocal, only mental, is recorded. Hannah spake in her heart. 1 Samuel 1:13. That prayer did God write down and answer. God was better to her than her prayer. She prayed for a son, and God gave her a prophet. At times the heart is so full of grief that it can only groan in prayer. Yet a groan is sometimes the best part of a prayer, and God writes it down. Lord, my groaning is not hid from thee. Psalm 38 verse 9. If we cannot speak with elegance in prayer, if it be only lisping and chattering, God puts it in his book of remembrance. Point 7. God writes down the alms of his people. Works of mercy must be done out of love to God, as Mary out of love brought her ointments and sweet spices and anointed Christ's dead body. So out of pure love we must bring our ointments of charity to anoint the saints, which are Christ's living body. Such alms are not lost. With such sacrifices God is well pleased. Hebrews 13 verse 16. How well the Lord is pleased with them. He writes them down thus. Item so much lent to the Lord, thine alms are come up for a memorial before God. Acts 10 verse 4. Point 8. God has a book of remembrance for the suffering of his people. The saints' purgatory is in this life, but there are two things which may bear up their spirits. So first, every groan of theirs goes to God's heart. I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel. Exodus 6 verse 5. In music, when one string is touched, all the rest sound. When the saints are stricken, God's heart reverberates. And secondly, God has a book of records to write down his people's injuries. The wicked make wounds in the backs of people's the wicked make wounds in the backs of the righteous and then pour in vinegar. God writes down their cruelty. I remember that which Amalek did to Israel. 1 Samuel 15 verse 2. Amalek was Esau's grandchild. Says enough. Genesis 36 verse 12. A bitter enemy of Israel. The Amalekites showed their spite to Israel in two ways. First they lay in ambush, and then Israel passed by, fell upon their rear, and cut off the feeble in their army. 1 Samuel 15 verse 2. And secondly, they openly gave battle to them and would have hindered them from going into Canaan. Exodus 17:8. Now God took notice of Israel's sufferings by Amalek. I remember what Amalek did to Israel, and I have my book of remembrance. I write it down. So now go smite Amalek. So 1 Samuel 15 verse 3. All right. First use of the doctrine is information, and information is, it shows us that it is not in vain to serve God. So the wicked who know not God think him a hard master, and say, like those Job speaks of, what profit should we have if we pray unto him? Job 21 verse 15. But the text shows us that God records all the services of his people. A book of remembrance was written before him. All right. An honor to the saints. The Romans wrote the names of their senators in a book, and in token of honor they were called the chosen fathers of the people. So God's book of remembrance shows his high esteem of his people and their services. He writes them down. Well, it's not for our esteem, it's for his esteem. This whole book of remembrance is not for us, that's for God himself, for his own esteem and for his own glory. Then a mark of the special favor God bears to his people. He registers them and their services with an intent to crown them. Tamerlane wrote down all the memorable deeds of his soldiers, so whom he afterwards preferred to places of dignity. Well, God's service is most desirable, not man's, but God's. Let us make Joshua's choice. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua 24, verse 15. If we should desert God's service, where shall we go? When Christ asked his disciples, will you also go away? And then Peter said, no, Lord, to whom shall we go? As if to say, if we leave thee, we do not know where to get help for ourselves. Let us adhere to God. He has his book of memorials to record our allegiance. We may be losers for him, but we shall not be losers by him. So the second, how many are they? The second, see from this that as God registers the good works of his people, so he has a book of remembrance to write down the sins of the wicked. Go write it before them in a table, and note it in a book, that it may be for the time to come forever and ever, that this is a rebellious people that will not hear the law of the Lord. Isaiah 38 and 9. Man's sins are written in the book of conscience and the book of God's omnisciency. They think because God does not speak to them by his loud judgments, therefore God does not know their sins. Well, that is a delusion, because God knows everything. Point 3. See the mercifulness of God to his children, who blots their sins out of his book of remembrance and writes their good deeds in his book of remembrance. So the Father, the living God, says then, I, even I, am he that blotteth out thy transgressions. Isaiah 43, verse 25. This is a metaphor borrowed from the case of a creditor who takes his pen and blots out the debt owing to him. So says God, I will blot out thy transgressions, or as the Hebrew has it, I am blotting them out. So God, in forgiving sin, passeth an act of oblivion, or you can say amnesty. Interesting where that organization got its name from, which is also known as forgetting. I will remember their sin no more. Jeremiah 31, verse 34. So God will not upbraid his people with their former offenses. We never read that when Peter repented, Christ upbraided him for his denial of his Lord. No. That is not God, and it's not like God to do so. Oh, the heavenly indulgence and kindness of God to his people. He remembers everything but their sins. He writes down their good thoughts and speeches in a merciful book of remembrance, but their sins are as if they had never been. They are carried into the land of oblivion. Well, second use, the exhortation. If God records our services, then let us record his mercies. Let us have our book of remembrance. A Christian should keep two books, always besides him, one to write his sins in, that he may be humble, the other to write his mercies in. Well, no believer is doing this nowadays, I can guarantee you that. That he may be thankful. David had his book of remembrance. He appointed certain of the Levites to record and to thank and praise the Lord God of Israel. We should keep a book to record God's mercies, though I think it will be hard to get a book big enough to hold them. At such and such a time, I lost track here. We were in straitened circumstances, and God supplied us. At another time under sadness of spirit, and God dropped in the oil of gladness. At another near death, and God miraculously restored us. If God be mindful of what we do for him, shall not we be mindful of what he does for us? Well, then we have no time for anything else, I think. And that's the whole point. God's mercies, like jewels, are too good to be lost. Get a book of remembrance. What I say in this time and age, and since we are in the last stages of the ending of this 1,000-year cycle, we are so occupied with everything and all nonsense of the world, and are so tremendously distracted and derailed by all these false Luciferian agendas, the false green agendas, the false divide and conquer agendas. Well, man is already so into their grave and so tired that where do they have the rest and peace to? Write down the things that God is doing for them. And another thing, many believers do not want to have themselves confronted daily with the things that they are doing. Third use, comfort. It is comfort to the godly. In the case of friends, forgetting them. Joseph did Pharaoh's butler a kindness, yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph but forget him? It is only too usual to remember injuries and forget friends. Well, it says a lot about the human nature and the poisoning that is brought into the human nature. But God has a book of remembrance where he writes down all his old friends. Near relations may sometimes be forgetful. The tender mother may forget her infant. Can a woman forget her Can a woman forget her sucking child? Ye, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. So Isaiah 49 verse 15. A mother may sooner be unnatural than God forgetful. Christ our high priest has the names of the saints written upon his breastplate and all their good deeds written in his book of memorials. Well, how many books would he have them? Let this be a bizarre stone to revive the hearts of God's people, though friends may blot you out of their mind, yet God will not blot you out of his book. And then the second point, this is consolation to the godly. The Lord keeps a book of remembrance for this end, that he may at the last day make a public and solemn mention of all the good which his saints have done. God will open his book of records and say, I was an-hungered, and ye gave me meat, thirsty, and ye gave me drink, etc. Matthew 25, verse 35 and 36. So the last piece of this study chapter, God will make known all the memorable and pious actions of his people before men and angels. He will say, here are those who have prayed and wept for sin. Here are those who have been advocates for my truth. Here are those who have laid to heart my dishonors and have mourned for what they could not reform. They are my re-owned ones, my Hepzibahs, in whom my soul delights. Isaiah 62 verse 4. What a glorious thing will this be, to have God express the high praise of his saints. When Alexander saw the sepulchre of Achilles, he cried out, O happy Achilles, who had Homer to set forth thy praise. What an honor will it be to have the names and worthy deeds of the saints mentioned, and God himself to be the herald, to proclaim their praises. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 5. And with this said, I have come to the reading of this study, this chapter 10 study. And thank you so much for listening, and God bless you.